Thank you very much, and thank you so much for inviting me tonight. I think it's a real privilege to talk on this subject. I have been involved with McKinsey on leading this research since 2007, and it's a topic that is very close to my heart. I would like to leave you tonight with one message, which is one is that gender diversity actually does matter. It is an important topic that companies and institutions and government need to tackle. It is positive, and it is something that can be done about. It is not inevitable. It is something on which, if you take actions, you can actually see results. So that's what it's important, and we can do something about it. What I'd like to do is spend the next 30 minutes or so talking about why it matters, what can be done, what really drives the impact, and how do we enable more women at the top, and then talk a little bit about the situation in Japan to see how that can be addressed. So let me start first by talking about why it matters and why McKinsey has a point of view on this. This is clearly a very, very hot topic across the world, whether you talk about the economists, whether you talk about the different discussions inside institution and government. The topic of gender equality has never had so much importance in the public eye over the last, I would say, 5 to 10 years. And in particular, the topic of women inside the workforce and inside the workplace has been very hot. We have started to work on this topic since 2007. And you might actually ask yourself, why does McKinsey as a consulting firm actually tackle that topic? And it's very simple. It's because when I was, at the time, I was just returned from China. And in China, we worked, we had our highest number of women colleagues in McKinsey. About 50% of our recruits were women. And so we had many, many teams. And in fact, we were at the same time saying, well, why are we not getting our fair share of women reaching the top of McKinsey? And when we were wrestling with that topic, we realized that many of our clients and many CEOs were asking the same questions. And so we decided to actually launch research and see what we could do or what companies could do. And the first question that was asked over the time was, does it matter? And there was a real question every time. By the way, if you would now ask it in the US or in Europe, it wouldn't be a question anymore. I think people actually now know that it matters. But that was the topic of the first research. That's why we called it Women Matter, because we actually said in 2007 that we could prove there was a link between company performance and representation of women at the senior level. And I'll come back to that one. We then followed up and tried to identify what was driving this positive link. And was there some explanation? And then we continued by looking at, in a more operational details, what were the actions that really drove an increased diversity. And recently, last year, we started to assess how the situation is in Asia, which I will come at the end of the speech, looking at Japan in the context of Asia. So that's what we've done. So we've done over now 6 years of research, which has been largely done also with the support of academics on that topic. And I'm very glad that we have done that, because I think it is a very important topic on which you needed a little bit of a fundamental thinking on that, on the experience. So let me talk about the substance of what we did. And let me start first by looking at I call it our European research, because I was in Europe when we started that research. It actually is global in nature, but I was based in Europe, so that's what it is. So the first things we did is we said, and I will follow a little bit the chronology that I described. First thing was, is there a positive influence of having women in the senior position? And we looked at it into two different dimensions. The first one is we looked at the financial performance of corporations. And what you see here is on the left side is on return on equity. On the right side of the chart is on EBIT margin, so profitability if you want. And what we've proven is companies with more women at the top had, on average, a return on equity or a profitability about 40% more than companies with no women in the executive committee. Now, you could say, okay, it could be because you've chosen the right numbers in 2007 before the crisis, or it was a certain repartition of industries. We've done this several times, in 2007. So before the crisis, during the crisis, after the crisis, or if you think that we are after the crisis. Other people have done it since then, and it actually is statistically robust. You can do it in Europe. You can do it on European stocks. You can do it on US stocks. So a little bit more difficult to do in Japan given the low numbers, but I'll come back to that. So this is very solid, works in about every industry with one exception, I think, which is telecom, which is, I think, linked more to the fact that there has been so much changes in the industry that it's probably the numbers don't completely work. So this is very robust. Companies with higher financial performance have also higher women at the top. And now, so that was one measure. We then said, okay, this is not completely satisfactory as a way. So can we relate it to the way that, to the what we call the organizational health of companies? And there we use a proprietary tool that McKinsey has, where we look at companies alongside what makes them work, their own internal culture. And what we have is we have a tool that basically surveys employees in companies. That tool has now about 1 million respondents, has been going on for over a decade, has about 1,000 companies in there. And what you have is we can calibrate companies around these 9 blocks of organization, what we call organizational health, which basically describe, how well is the direction of the company understood on the top. Let me just use maybe or what's the type of environment and values is the company, how innovative is the company, what's the type of accountability system that there is on it. Now, this tool, as I said, is statistically significant and has proven time and again that having high scores on these boxes will lead to companies have also higher financial performance. So again, it's the health drives performance of companies. So what happens if you compare companies with women at the top and companies that don't have women at the top? And what we see is on each of these boxes, you see a positive increase in the scores. Now, the interesting factoid of it is that the scores don't really move until you have 3 women in the executive team. 1 woman versus 0 doesn't make a difference. 2 versus 0 doesn't make a difference. 3 versus 0 does make a difference. But they are around areas such as, better sense of direction, better sense of our environment and values, better coordination and control. Again, statistically significant. We've cut it across Asia, across US, across Europe, and the relationships hold. So it's very clear that whether you look at it from purely a financial performance, which is an output, or versus what we call the organization health, how well the company employees understand what the company stands for, having more women at the top is correlated to performance. Now, we know that correlation is not causality. So then the next year, which was the next year, we said, okay, what drives this? What can be part of it? And part of the explanation we found is around the types of leadership models that men and women use. So let me, again, complicated chart, so give me a couple of minutes to go through it. What we did is we looked at basically the type of leadership behaviors men and women use, using basically academic research done by Professor Avolio and Professor Eagly in the United States, which is based on about a sample of over 100,000 people. And what you see when you look at the different leadership model, whether it is the way people development, whether you manage people through clarity of expectations and reward, whether you look at the way that people make decision making by participative or by individual, you can see that statistically men and women use these type of models with different frequencies. Right? It's a frequency question. It's not do you do it better, it's how often do you use it. And what you can see is, it has been proven many times, women apply more behaviors around people development. I will make this, I will help people grow in their role. Or they will use more like role modeling. I will do it myself so that people can replicate it. And men, and that's pretty obvious, do it more like I will make the decision and you will follow. And, or I will control what you do, and if I don't like you, I will fire you, which is a sort of, So, and statistically what happens is these behaviors drive the organizational health, the 9 boxes that I talked about. And some of these boxes, which you saw a higher score on, are driven by the fact that the more women at the top, the more often do you use certain leadership behaviors. So what the answer is, yes, it matters. There is no question. And 2, it is partly driven, but only partly by the fact that men and women bring different leadership models, different leadership behaviors to corporations, therefore bring a richer set of look at the companies and the company's future. It won't replace a bad strategy. That's the other learning from this. Bad strategies will still kill you, but your leadership behaviors will help. So then we talked about, okay, if you want to do this, what can you do to make sure that men and women exceed at the top and the women actually do? So what we found is we actually benchmarked 235 European companies who actually agreed to give us all the numbers. We were actually very surprised because when we started to do this thing, we hesitated a lot because we thought that companies would not be very comfortable with sharing gender diversity data. And so we actually had been very optimistic and said, we'll probably get 30 companies. We could not stop. We stopped at 235. So, which tells you how important this topic is, right? This is a serious topic, at least in Europe. And I'll come back to Japan in a minute. And what we saw is that there is 3 major elements that you need to put in place. The first one is you need to have top management commitment. The second one is you need to have what we call women in individual development programs as leaders. And the third one is what we call collective enablers. So let me comment a little bit. Management commitment is the fact that it is visible that it is an important topic for the CEO and executive team, that there are some targets and some metrics, and that there is a consistency of the culture of the company with gender diversity. So for example, if you have lots of women with kids, you don't have all the networking activities done in bars in the evenings. True thing of one of our clients who actually changed that, and that made a huge difference. The Women Development Program is very important. It is about understanding that women, because they have different leadership style, have different needs in terms of training and development. So it is around things like creating networking programs for women, having specific leadership skill training, or having mentoring program and events. Now, you can ask why these things are particular. Because what we've observed in our, I've interviewed maybe 50 women CEOs or C-level executives through that work. We collectively probably interviewed 200. And what was very clear is that there is a couple of things that men do naturally and women don't do as well. And one of them is around, how do you use networks? How do you create networks? And also the availability of sponsors, of mentors, of people who will help you in your career. And so there is a need for certain type of training and development of women as individual leaders. And then the third thing is what we call collective enablers, which are roughly around the HR systems. Having flexibility systems, having maternity leave, ramp-on, ramp-off programs, having gender-targeted recruiting events, et cetera, et cetera. So these are, interestingly enough, where most companies focus a lot of their efforts, because you can delegate it to HR, and therefore, you think you've done your work. But what our view is, we saw that any companies that were successful had to have a large part of those three elements in place. So then the question becomes, okay, what really counts? What makes a difference in all of these things? And now that's interesting because we did measure, and we did a simple measurement on a few of these elements. And what we looked at is companies with more women at the top, companies with less women at the top, and what were they implementing? Now, the most important measure in terms of having for companies who are successful is the visibility of the CEO commitment. It's absolutely essential. It drives more difference in representation than any of the other ones. The second one is around having programs for developing women as leaders, as individual leaders, as opposed as a cohort or a group. And then the third collective enablers, is just the minimum to win. By itself, if you only do this, that will make no difference. And unfortunately, that's where most companies have been focused their attention for many years. So a very important point, it is that it is not just an HR problem, it is a CEO level problem, and it is about attention to one at a time. And we can talk about McKinsey, that's our experience as well. Now, the other second very important point is implementation matters. Again, a little bit of a complicated chart, sorry about that. But I would just draw your attention to the first line. And we looked at companies with, on the right side of the charts, that have made a lot of progress with diversity. So they have a high representation of women, they're very well implemented, versus companies that have very limited progress on diversity. Not that many women at the top, not very interested. The biggest question is that on average, the companies implement much more and much better. That's surveys on how well their executives believe implementation has been done. Companies have to be serious about this. They have to implement it well, right? Same thing. Second thing I would put in, number of indicators used to track female representation. On a poorly performing company, they only track 3 elements, probably total number of women as a percentage, and entry level and executive committee level. The companies who really do very well track on minimum 6 indicators. We track many more than that. So it's really not just, it's about having a commitment and then making sure the implementation is there. So that's the experience in Europe. 1, it does matter. Second, it is about richness of leadership style and outlook at life. 3, you need 3 elements. But CEO, if you don't have CEO commitment, it's very hard to make a progress. And 4 is implementation really counts. So let me turn for a few minutes on where are we in Japan. Now, we're not very far. That's the first thing, but we all know that. Also, I have my favorite thing as a French is that I think the Germans are about as bad, so that's okay, right? So, you can beat the Germans, that's for sure. Now, what's really interesting is, so Japan is very low on the executive committee and corporate boards. You see the usual suspects, Sweden, Scandinavia being there. What's very important about it is corporate board is not the right measure. The real measure is executive committee. The second interesting element in this chart is that It is not, most people originally think it's a question of the US and Europe has started much earlier, therefore, they must be much better. You can see that Asia, there are some very interesting countries that have made a lot of progress on this side. So Japan has a lot to do. But what's interesting about it is, and if you take Japanese, because of low numbers, you cannot do the same statistically significant research that I showed before. But you can do a series number of cross tabs. And what you can prove is that companies in Japan who have higher profitability tend to also have higher women in the top ranks. And I've used one number here, but I have seen about 3 or 4 different things done by professors at different universities that prove the same thing. On average, companies with higher diversity tend to have higher performance. So I think the case is the same. It does matter. It matters also in Japan. And the other thing that's interesting about Japan is that you've seen progress. And I would just say that if I compare to my own country, this picture 30 years ago was not that great either. But I think once you are getting into a trajectory, that trajectory will continue. And the only real question is, can you accelerate it? But so we've seen also some progress in Japan, whether it's section chief managers or general managers. Again, low numbers, but it takes time before you develop a leader. We are a little bit constrained in Japan by labor participation. This is the comparison of labor participation rate of the different countries. As you can see, Asia is lower than Europe or other developed countries. China is very interesting at 70. The more shocking number is India. 35% only of women are in the labor force. They have a major problem with that. So there is we have a little bit of a challenge in retaining. And that's a famous M curve where many of the women actually leave the workforce around the moment of the childhood. But the biggest barrier is interesting. We've done this research. We've compared what women thought was the biggest barrier in Europe versus Asia. And that's just true in most. We've done that we launched a research over 10 countries in Asia in 2012. And these are they are, by the way, in pretty much every country coming back with the same order, right? And what's interesting is if you look at Europe, most of the barriers are around the issues of functioning in the corporate world. It is about the double burden syndrome, anytime, anywhere performance model. You can move and go to the next country. You should be ready to leave within the next 24 hours, type of things. Or women's personal reluctance to promote themselves in their new role. But in Asia, we do have a problem, which is that lack of pro-family public policies or support services is still a very big barrier. Interestingly enough, in Japan, everybody would understand that because of the whole issue of childcare and so on and so forth. But it is true also in low-cost labor countries. So if you would talk about China or India, the women would tell you the same thing. And the issue, which I learned to my surprise, is trust. So will you have a childcare system which you will trust? Now, I come from France, a country where has an extremely strong support system from the government. And it's true that it's a question I'd never asked myself. When we had our first children, they went into the daycare center. But I also now realize that all the daycare centers were certified by the government with a very, very high level of trust. And so this is an area for the government that is real. But the good news, I think, is we have now the potential pipeline of women in Japan. This is on the left side is a proportion of women in university graduates. And in Japan in 1975, you had 21%. Today you have 43%. And by the way, if you just want to go back to it, France, we are about at the level of where France was in 1975. And I can tell you, in France in 1975, this was not a very, very women-friendly environment in companies, right? I mean, this is, I remember it when at that time. But it has changed drastically in the last 10 to 15 years. So I think you have the potential, and I think there is enough women that can make that transition. The other thing to have in mind is when many of my women colleagues actually say, we don't have enough role models in Japan as being women that are successful. Well, there was no way you could have role models. Because if 80% of women in the country have incomes that are relating to a high school diploma, you cannot afford to actually work and have children. It's not possible. You know, whatever you get paid with no government support doesn't work. But that equation is totally different now. That equation is now reversing. We have enough women who will, if they want to, with the support of the government, be able to actually choose a professional life. So I think, what we said in Japan, this is a real serious issue, but things are changing. We have a bit more women working now. We have many more that have the right education level to be successful in that environment. And I think there is some work that has been done on government support. The question is, where do we need to make a difference? And I think where the real challenge is in Japan is on what we call the early management roles. This is basically a funnel. You take all the university graduates, then people can become entry-level professional, then they become mid to senior management, then they reach the executive committee level and CEO and board level. Now, this is the interesting thing. China has about 50% university graduate, Japan 49. It's depending on how you calculate the numbers. But China goes from 55% entry-level professional as women to 21. So they drop by 25%. We dropped from 45 to 11. That means at that moment, we don't have any candidates for the future. And that's a real issue. So one thing that's very important is, as corporations or as a government, we need to really focus efforts on making it possible for people in their 30s and making it likable for women in their 30s to continue to work. And this means a series of interventions. Now, it's as an interesting side effect, Singapore, which is not that far away, has a much better pass-through rate. And so it's something to learn about what has happened. The other interesting question, by the way, which is on this one, is Korea. So Korea is very low. That's the other place that's very low. But what's interesting is, if you come back to this question about, and I don't know if I have the chart. Yes. One of the issues that we have in Japan is the fact that it is not yet, gender diversity is not yet seen as a strategic priority. And if you actually remember what I said at the beginning, that being a visibility of CEO commitment, executive commitment was absolutely crucial, we do have a problem. Europe is now about 50% believe of people of senior executive believe that gender diversity is on the top 10 of their company agenda. In Japan, only 25%. South Korea is now at 48%. Thanks for the last government and the new government's action. So something needs to be done. By the way, the same number in Europe 5 years ago would have been about 25%. So it has changed, and that can be changing very, very fast. But this is one big issue, is for companies to actually say, this is important, we're going to do something about it. The second big issue is around the cultural acceptance. If you look at here, again, sorry about the data, but in Japan, about 34% of women say that the notion that women have to take care of the family is fundamental in the reason why they leave their jobs, which is a much lower number in Australia or Singapore, which we saw were much higher. And it's something to do with the cultural and the public debate about whether this is actually something good for society, that women should work and have a family at the same time. So second barrier. First barrier, visibility of CEO commitment. Second barrier is acceptability that having a dual professional life and family life is a good thing. So just as in the interest of time, I will now conclude. But I would say, remind you of what I said here. One, it is very important. It has been proven time and again. And we need to actually make sure that that happens. It's important for companies' performance, for society's performance. Two, you can do something about it, as I said in my opening remarks. But you have to actually take actions on three major elements, which is it has to be a priority for the CEO and the executive team. You have to be thinking about developing women as individual leaders. And then, of course, you need to put in place the right HR systems and collective enablers that will make it simple for women to be successful. On this, thank you very much for that, and we'll move to questions.
Good evening. Thank you very much for coming on a Monday night. And I'd like to go by George and Tomo, if we may.
Of course.
George, thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. When you first got this research, did you imagine that ROE would be this much different?
Well, I can tell you, we had a few months of real worry because typical consulting approach. We said, okay, we'll make an hypothesis that there will be a correlation, but we had no idea whether it was going to work. So when we saw the numbers, the first thing I said was, I'm glad it works. But then the second thing is exactly what you meant. We were really surprised at how important the difference was, because the difference is not something that you can debate with, and it's been proven time and again. So depending on the sample, you can go from 25 to 56%, but fundamentally that difference is significant.
You said that your research is statistically robust.
Yeah.
So whatever country you take or whatever year you take, there is this much difference. Wow.
I mean, depending on the, of course, it might differ by a little bit in terms, but the relationship holds. Except, as I said, in Japan, because we don't have enough women at the top of corporations, so that limits our sample size. But I hope that will change in the future.
Yeah. Yes. Okay. Thank you very much. Because I'm a professor in the leadership arena, I have a personal question. What was your feeling when you were first assigned to run this project?
Okay. There was an interesting history to this project. The reason why this project happened was that, as I was saying, I was in China. I was coming back from China to Europe. And in China, I had worked, most of my teams were, at least half men, half women. And so I really started to be quite interested in how do you make women stay at McKinsey. And so when I went back and I started to talk about it with a few of my colleagues in Paris, and in particular one of my close colleague, Sandrine de Villard, who is a senior partner at the firm, and one of my personal friends who had founded at the time something called the Women's Forum, which was a Women's Forum for Society Economics, the topic was about the contribution of women. And so we at one point collectively figured out that, one, we were all asking the same question, and two, there was not a real good answer. So that's where we decided to investigate it. So it was really not a top-down view. It was more a few people who had actually a common interest in the cause, who said, let's try to do something that is so academically robust that at least there will be an answer. And that's how this whole adventure started.
I see. I remember you mentioning that this project kind of touched your heart.
Yes.
Why?
Because it's interesting. when I first started this project, I actually had a very theoretical view of that thing. It was like, okay, we'll look at it but it was what I did not realize is how how different the situation were for women versus men, and second, what some of the things that I took for granted that I realized that were struggles for women. So, to give you an example, I mentioned that I interviewed maybe 50 senior executive women personally, and the first few times that a woman would tell me, part of my problem is I really was not I was shying away from taking responsibility. I was like, well, what, it's got to be it's got to be you, right? And then I realized it was a general statement, and I realized, therefore, that there was something that it was much more inhibiting than I personally. And I realized at that moment that the system was made for basically us men. And so it became very important for me to say, okay, how do we really make that change so that we actually give equal change to women, and get the best and get those fantastic women that I interviewed, get more of them. And so that's really made it very personal through those interactions.
I understood that in China, 50% of your professionals were women.
Yep.
But if I remember your story a little bit, you are a father of daughters?
Yes, well, that's true. As one of my friends once told me, she said, well, there's 3 segments of men who care about women in the workplace. There is the CEOs whose companies do very, very badly with women because they want to pretend they do something. There is the CEOs who companies do very, very well because they want to boast to their men friends. And there are fathers who have daughters. So I fall into that third category. So I have 3 daughters, and I really want them to be successful so I don't have to take care of them. And they can take care of me.
I'm also a father of a daughter, so that brings ownership to this dialogue. When you first started the research, and a very strong, a difference came out. If women executives are in the company, the returns are much better. The company has a much better communication. How was the research received in Europe?
It was interesting. It was by and large, quite well, with some exceptions. I think there was first of all, extremely well by women, as you can imagine. But particularly because they saw that our team had men. And so there was actually they were very reassured that this was not going to be portrayed as, sort of a feminist approach to it. It was actually robust. But then it became very intriguing for many constituents, in particularly politicians, which we had a whole series of discussions about trying to avoid testimonials in sort of strange circumstances. There's only 2 places that where we got irate clients calling us and saying, you should cease and desist. This is not McKinsey, and so on, which was was the southern United States and Germany, which is part of my, and now Germany has changed totally because now they've announced to have targets of 30%. And so I take it as a personal victory that we've changed the Germans. But
Thank you very much. Ogawa-san, can you put George's research on the table? Yeah. You were talking about the 9 dimensions.
Yes.
I'd like to understand how you do this research.
Okay.
Is it, as I have a lot of MBA students, is it like a balanced scorecard system, or how do you measure the 9 dimensions? Yeah.
So we have a proprietary tool called OHI, Organizational Health Index, and which is now more than 10 years in action. What it is we ask employees of a company questions around, for example, around the way the company functions, both in terms of what practices are used in the company and what outcomes happen. So, for example, there will be something about questions such as, I believe my supervisor gives me honest feedback. Or it will be questions around, there is in our company, people who perform well will be recompensated accordingly. Or, and people score from 0 to 7 on these things. Or there is a clear consequence if objectives are not met. So we have about 150 questions or so on, which we administer. And what's important about this is the perception from the employees about their own company. I understand the company vision, or I understand my supervisor understands the company vision, etc. And what we have found is that we could do a factor analysis, which has come up to those 9 blocks, which are blocks of the similar natures. So direction setting, do we understand the direction of the company? Do people understand the strategy, etc.? Or if you take something like external orientation, do we look at the outside world to make improvements? Do we have a good relationship with suppliers? So we know that these 9 blocks, and we have statistically correlated these 9 blocks with increased performance over time. So that's the basic of that.
So if I understood correctly, and you are mentioning that implementation is very important.
Yeah.
You can ask employee survey each year, and
right.
you can measure the progress
Absolutely.
for your clients.
Which we have done, in many, we've used it also in mergers. For example, if you actually are trying to get 2 company cultures together, we've done it in Japan, for example, you can measure on a quarterly basis, are people feeling better about their work environment and values? What's important about this tool, and the reason why it's useful in this gender diversity question, it is not a tool about, are you happy? Right? This is not about, do you feel good? It is a tool about what happens to you as an individual and what happens to the company. And so then you measure over time what happens. It happens that there is a correlation between having good scores and being happy and having good scores and having a well-performing company. But it's because you are doing the right things that you actually have a good outcome. And it's, from a organizational behavior point of view, it's very important. We believe very strongly that company health, i.e. the fact that these things go well, will drive performance. If you don't have company health, over time, you don't have performance.
So in that way, my intuitive understanding of balanced scorecard was quite similar.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
It's a little bit of a complex and very, many scores, and we try to get it into a smaller card.
I see. Thank you. And as a consequence, by running this research, you kind of analyzed the cultural differences. You said that southern part of America and Germany was especially low.
Not on this research. We couldn't find it on this research, or at least I've not tried. But you're giving me ideas.
I see. And what was, how was your clients in Asia when you first, showed these results, including Japan?
Yeah.
Maybe can you share the situation in Asia?
Okay, so I think if I compare Asia and Europe or the US, we are still in Asia at this question: does it matter? So if I look at most of the discussions I had in Japan, I have discussed this with METI, Keizai Doyukai, and so on. The first question is we're still there. Europe and US is not a discussion anymore, but it was a discussion in 2007. But it's now not a discussion anymore. In Asia and in Japan, it's still a question, and for the right reason, because I don't think you should do this to feel good. This is about a business reason. This is better for the business. This is better for society. And now I think we are at that level of debate. I think we are now moving past this debate, but so we are a bit behind on that one.
Thank you. I'd like to throw in another maybe management concept. This time it's not accounting. When we talk about inclusion, how many people we involve in the discussion? Can we say that having more women representation would make a company a much better citizen in terms of filling the gap between maybe women's needs in the household, or?
I think what's, again, it is not about feeling good about this, but it is about, can you make better decisions? And I think what you have with more women is there's many products, for example, where most of the decision making now are made by women. Even if you take cars in the US, research shows that about 80% of decisions are one way or the other influenced by women. If you don't have women in the decision-making area, you are taking a risk that you don't understand well enough. And so I think that's been very well understood by luxury good company or cosmetics. Shiseido is a great example. But I think it is true in many more topics where decision-making is driven by different genders.
I'd like to share maybe 2 examples. I used to work in a wedding business, and it used to be male managers making decisions in actual wedding deals. I kind of tried to put the ladies in front, kind of move the male manager into a different area and let the ladies make all the decisions. Wedding planners, we called, usually in the 20s. And they associate themselves very well with the bride. So, in fact, a lot of our weddings have gone up in sales. More customization in, the lunch or the dinner, in cakes, in lots of fireworks. And also, all sorts of things came out where if it was a male manager deciding with maybe, a young lady, those things would not have come out. Mm-hmm. At Globis, we have currently welcomed a lady to a board, Miss Oka, who runs an M&A professional firm. I think we have 26% representation of female managers at Globis, and I think that's making a difference. So, can we say your research is in line with this kind of examples?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely, and I think it is. I think it is sound business practice to think about your customers and think, will you understand them?
If you can you share some best practice at McKinsey?
Well, actually, so we are a long way from being where I aspire for us to be, but we've made significant progress. And we basically, about 10 years ago, decided that we really needed to improve the situation. And it became, again, from a fundamental judgment, if you want, on our profession, which is that we are a profession based on people. Our biggest constraint is talent. And if you look at the world, 50% of the IQ of the world is with women, or my daughters would say actually 50% at least. My dad, remember that. Okay, well, it's probably true actually, but and so we decided that we had to make an effort. So we put in place something we called very creatively the Women Initiative, which Paul McInerney, my colleague who's here, leads for Japan. And it's fundamentally where what we did is we analyzed the situation and said, okay, how can we improve? And so what we do is, to give you examples, we measure all the time. So we measure not only at recruiting, but at every major change in promotions, and we look at whether there is a bias of men versus women at promotion level. We look at the reasons, we measure the reasons why women opt out of McKinsey, and we compare. So that's, we have specific training programs for women, have been developed by women for women, around things like one thing we call gravitas, which is around building confidence in public and so on. We create networking events for women. All series of what's interesting about it is many of these very successful programs have become so successful that the men have required them, and it's now part of everybody's training. We create flexibility system, so we have a system called Take Time where people can take time off in having planned it. We now have about 500, I think, across the world. Actually, about half men and women. So we have a number of programs. But the thing that is also interesting is we have a lot of symbolic actions. And that, I think, is something to have in mind. And there's two that I always like to comment. The first one is I talked about metrics, right? So one of my friend, Sandrine, with whom I did the research, who leads the Women Initiative globally, has initiated something which has been incredibly powerful, which is, unfortunately, given age and tenure, many of the key leaders are still men. But what she did is she actually shares the scorecards with all the men in the same room at the same time, with all the leaders in the same room at the same time. And guess what happens? Everyone looks at each other and says, you see, I'm much better than you. So there's a peer pressure created by just sharing the... And the second thing is a very interesting story, which about every 18 months, we have a conference with all the partners of McKinsey, so the senior people of McKinsey. And what happened is a few years ago, the most senior women created what they called an award dinner on invitation only, which is basically you are invited, each woman of the firm, of the partners, women partners, can invite one man, and one man only. And so you basically have, and of course they're very smart about who they invite, right? They invite, and they basically elect the best mentor, the best mentor of women every 18 months. But it's become the place to be, because you are invited. They invite all the leaders of the firm. It's a small group session. And so there is the dinner and the men's dinner. And so the whole point is about how can you be invited to the dinner. And that made it very, and so there has become a competition to become a coach and a mentor. People want to be invited. They want to be mentors. And therefore, you've seen an enormous increase in, I think, the quality of mentorship for women in the firm.
Thank you. I don't think not many companies is at McKinsey's level, but
we could be much better. So.
We would like to benchmark and learn from your company. You were mentioning personally, I graduated from university when the gender equality law was in place. Yep. So a lot of my colleagues, I had female colleagues. Can you open the chart between male leadership and female leadership? Thinking back at when the first equality law was placed,
yep.
I had a feeling that sometimes a female's leader's attention was taken by another female leader. So what I'm saying is not necessarily all the female seniors can be role models, but
yep.
sometimes they work as a hindrance.
Yep.
And is there any advice for the ladies for the next generation to come?
Yeah.
And I'd like to ask the same question to the male as well later on, but whichever one you like to start us off.
Well, I think that's a very important point, because I think there is always this question about, okay, can we have a role model, right? And it's true. Having role models is one of the best way to develop, but it's very hard in an environment like, for example, Japan today, or France 30 years ago, because there was no role models. And in fact, if you had, and we actually did the research on that, if you actually had women who had been successful as CEOs in that period, they were, and this is statistically proven, so they would actually conform to men's standards. And, and in fact, they don't have children and so on. And so, and why? Because they had to fight the system in a very big way. So it's I think it's illusory to think that role models will exist per se if you're that. So as my women colleagues would say, you have to do that. So now you do have women that are very extraordinary role model in every geographies, but it is more difficult. So that's the one thing, and it's a difficult. So this is where I think senior women who have succeeded have a role to play. And I remember one of my major clients in Europe before I moved to Japan is a woman. She's a CEO of one of the largest French companies. But she has been in France for now about 7 years or 8 years. Before that, she spent 20 years of her career in the US. And when she arrived in France, I said to her, you have to help and you have to be successful. And she said, well, give me a break. I don't believe in this. This is so bad, feel good. And then 3 years later, she said to me, you're right. I mean, I have to spend time. I have to, because we are not yet at the point where it becomes completely normal, or it is completely normal and there is enough people, enough women around that can demonstrate. So a role model is a challenge, and it is a challenge, I think, in a geography like here. But there is other things that women can and should do, right? And in particular, I think one of the things that I've observed and we've looked at in all our interviews is it is about projecting oneself in the future. What you see between the men and women is men tend to think about their career in the longer term. Women tend, and again, I'm not making this up, tend to not promote themselves. So there is a notion of career planning, which can be helped by a man. Because a man can sit down and think about and tell what is the career plan that you have in your mind. Second thing is, it is about taking risks and taking jobs that you don't feel as comfortable. There is ample research that says, if you take, 100, it's been done, I think, with Harvard Business School students. So, but if you take, 100 men and 100 women in a room and you say, here's a job, do you feel you can? 99% of men will say, yes, tomorrow. And, yesterday, actually. And, and 99% of the women will say, I'm not yet qualified. And so I think there is a notion of take risks, you're well enough prepared. And then the third thing that women can do, I think, is this notion of looking for networks and looking for sponsors. And sponsors don't have to be women. They can be men. Men naturally find them because there are more occasions to meet them. Women have to make an effort. So it's a two-way street. The corporations can help, but I think the women have to do their share.
What can we do as male?
I think first of all is be aware of the issue. Do not think that this is do not think that this is just a small question. There is differences. Don't overstate them, but realize that the same way that you will treat differently somebody with a different cultural background, there's the same thing. People have been raised, trained differently. Second, I think what is very important is offer mentorship and sponsorship, which are two different things. Mentorship is offer advice, be there for advice, and sponsorship. If you can do something for someone, do it. I think that's the most important thing. That's where you make a difference.
So when you say sponsorship, I think it includes seniors, both women and men. Yep. But it is to, give, let's say, a junior, maybe a lady, a chance for maybe new assignments, new roles. Is that what you mean when you say?
It is. That is the most extreme way, and it's a good way. But I think sponsorship is even more. It could be something as simple as okay, I will give a call to someone to see whether whether they can meet you. It's just take concrete action that will make a difference.
So helping her with the network.
Exactly.
I see.
A mentor provides advice,
Okay.
like a consultant.
I see.
A sponsor takes action.
Okay, thank you. George, maybe one last question before we open up to the floor. You talked about government involvement,
Yep.
and your country, France, I think has been one of the most successful
Yep.
in increasing birth rate of one lady in her lifetime. Also, how to say, you mentioned about the M kind of shape
yeah.
of women leaving their job, but in France, what I hear, there's a very high,
them.
So comparing France with maybe Japan or some Asian countries, is there any kind of recommendation that you would like to make to policymakers or?
Yeah, it's first of all, the first point I would make is, when I see where France is today, everybody talks to me about France being a role model for women, for gender diversity. It makes me laugh, right? When I grew up, right? I mean, it's most, if you take HEC, which is the leading business school, one of my good friend of mine who is my age, it was the fourth year that were women allowed. That was 30 years ago. So, I mean, I don't think. But what is really true is, if you really pay attention to it, things can change fast. That's what France, I think, demonstrates. The second thing I think is, it is true that I think the government has a role to play in there. And I think, I don't know whether you want to be as generous and maybe broke as the French are with, with all the subsidies, but we do give a lot of subsidies to mothers at all level of income to actually help people being able to have daycare. To me, the most important thing is there's two things that I think the government is very important. One is this whole issue of daycare. And I think in Japan, I think it's an issue, which is not just about quantity, but also about quality and trust and comfort. In France, basically at 2 years old, your child can go to school. At 6 weeks, they can start to be in a daycare center. And you're very, very reassured with the quality of care, right? And that's really, really heavily monitored. So I think that's a big deal. In Japan, my impression from talking to younger colleagues is that this is still a real challenge. The second thing, I think, is this notion of public debate. Because there is this question about making it important, not just for CEOs. In Japan right now, I tell you, all the CEOs I've met, I don't know, at least 60 or more than that, CEOs of Japanese companies since I've been here. The issue of women in the corporation is present for the majority of them. The problem is, how do you actually make that happen with the middle management, in particular the HR guys, who are all middle-aged guys, men, right? And so, which is very different from Europe, where it's mostly women. So you have to persuade that this is and then the other people we have to persuade is you have to make it as a good thing for society to that women, and persuade the mothers that they should go to university, right? If you look at the enrollments in Todai for the last 10 years, it's clearly well under where it should be, and the only explanation has to be that women don't apply, because it's not the number of seats. And that's where public debate helps, because I've seen that in Europe, where the notion of public debate about, is it important, should there be equality, what's the right target, is making it everybody question, and therefore is making the whole, the burden of proof becomes inverted, which means men have to explain why it shouldn't be normal for women to be successful. And that's, I think, something the government can play a role.
Maybe McKinsey can do a little bit of consulting for the Japanese government.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your speech today. It was very educational. I learned a lot from this today. You mentioned a lot about the importance of having women development programs to get the women up, women inclusion in the executive upper positions, and this is something a lot of people are not so aware of. And you touched upon importance of raising networking skills and mentoring skills and such. Can you elaborate a little bit further into what kind of programs are effective on women and what kind of effect this has on women?
Okay. Um, so let me give you a few examples. So many companies, for example, will put in place, you could call it women's club or women associations, which where women can network, which is sponsored by the company, which is one way you create networks. What's very important is if you only keep it to women with women, then it becomes a bit of a problem. So it's very important to actually ensure that there is, at these events, there are, men are invited with women. Again, this is where the CEO involvement is very important. One of my clients, for example, they have a circle like this in Europe, but the CEO actually shows up, on a regular basis to signify that this is a really important thing. So, you create this. You create also having these, helping women being part of cross companies networks. So there are many places where there is cross-company women network, so that you can actually create and find role models outside of your own organization. If there's not that many, then there is areas where you can find it. So that's one way you create the networks, is through these sort of informal associations and so on. On the development programs themselves, I don't think that's necessarily that different from what you would do for men, but it is. But you have to take into account that women tend to have more complex trajectories, especially if they are mothers, because they will, if they have maternity, they will ramp out, they will rejoin, and therefore there needs to be attentions to those very specific moments. So some companies, for example, pay a lot of attention on making sure that before the person comes back from maternity leave, there is a job of a similar stature being ready for them, which is an important part. Some are even now going to the point of saying, we know that women will have a maternity and several children over a certain period of time. Therefore, if we wait, they will be, when they come back and be ready for a managerial position, they'll be far behind the men. And so what some of them are starting to do, they're starting to actually give earlier leadership opportunity than they would give to men in a more controlled environment, so that before they leave on maternity leave, they have had some experience on leadership roles. Now, all of this means very particular attention one by one, right? If I look at my own experience at McKinsey, it's one by one is the critical thing. So you need attention. And then the third point I would point out in development program is this notion of skill training. So there is a certain number of skill training around what type of influence model you use. Again, those are generally also happen for men, but they're very often been tailored towards the dominant models. And so you need to actually make sure that they will tackle the leadership model that women might use less frequently as opposed to the others. Or things around confidence training. We have, at McKinsey, we have a program around which is called Centered Leadership, which there is a book about, which is all about creating a series of ways for women to define what they want to do, because it's also been shown that women tend to be much more confident in their leadership if they have meaning, if they find meaning in what they do. Actually, by the way, men do too, but but it's sort of, for some reason, we looked at it from the women angle first. But and you have to have specific programs that are tailored to that. And it's very important that corporations should not think this is bad. Because what I hear a lot, including from women, is say, we're treated as second-class citizens because we have different trainings, and those trainings are to remedy to our problems. It's not. It's just that, hey, you grow up some certain way, you have certain strengths, certain development areas. Hey, you do it. It happens that most of the systems in companies have been trained to train the majority. And the majority has been men. And therefore, they are very well suited to the majority. So therefore, you need to do a program to suit the other part. That's what I think.
Thank you. Can I hold you, Christian? Just for a minute. I hope that the ladies who are studying at Globus, they have gained confidence and also skills. So there's little to do at the companies, I hope. Christian? Yeah. Yeah. Mm.
Hi, I'm Christina from the full-time program. I'm Taiwanese and been in the US for 10 years, and this is my first year in Japan, and I'll be graduating in September. So being in Japan, it seems to me that it's extra tough being a woman in the business world. It's a kind of, for me, it's a hostile environment. Whereas if you, let's say you have to grab a quick bite in between classes, and then if you go to Sukiya, they say Sukiya is not a place for women. So you should take out and then eat at home by yourself, not be seen by anyone. So that's one impression of Japan. I feel like it's kind of very imbalanced in the gender-wise. And then my second is that in the internship company that I'm working at right now, on my floor, there's about 200 people, and maybe a third of them are women, about 30 to 40 teams, and 100% all the team managers are men. So this initiative of gender diversity, if it's not from top down, can it go from bottom up? And then my third question, if you are a woman and a man tell you when you're working really hard saying that you're a woman and this is a men's game, and why do you have to play by the men's rule? How would you respond?
A number of loaded questions. No, I mean, it is, I can't comment on the cultural side of what you are, because I think it's, every country has, and every culture has very different views of what's, what the cultural life is. And it not necessarily relates into the workforce, to be honest. If you look at some of the Arab countries, actually, women have actually very prominent positions. Not necessarily visible, but, very influential. I think this is where, you could have said exactly, but no, but it's true. Truly, it was not a very well accepted. It's changing, right? And so this is where, if you don't have it's very hard to change from the bottom up if you don't have the top. And that's what we've seen in the research. It sounds obvious, but unless you actually see it, because when we say it has to come from the top, it is not about talking. It is about the senior management actually doing visible and tangible actions. It is about the CEO, or in Japan, maybe a broader group because of the consensus building, but taking, taking mentoring roles with women visibly. It is about attending those networking sessions. It is about, it is signaling in a very, very clear way that this is an important topic and therefore things need to change. That's how you will then have change. And then you need to actually then also have a top-down review of all the processes. How many, one of the things, for example, we've done at McKinsey, but many of our clients now are doing is reviewing all of this process, HR process, to make sure that actually things are gender diverse. For example, if you have in your evaluation system that somebody somebody is really committed because they are available 24/7, right? Guess what? No mother with a family will ever work, right? So you got to change those how these things are written in order to make sure that you can't create the bias. It takes a lot of work to get that done, and so so do I believe it's going to come naturally? Absolutely not, right? I mean, and you can look at all the numbers. Everybody says France is fantastic. You look at the numbers, the evolution of women is actually not going at the speed where just the education would suffice. So it is about interventions, and it is. Now, the question about the men's, what would I respond? I would respond, maybe we have a difference in generation, because I think a lot of people who have those type of comments, my mother would never have thought that it would have been a good thing for my sisters to I mean, she always worked her whole life, so she thought working was good. But being a very successful business person, wasn't part of her mental model. So you can't, if you've not experienced it, so you got to just say, you know what, your opinion, my opinion. Move on.
Christina, I'll try to respond on the cultural aspect.
You probably much better for that.
No. As George said, in generation, there's a change, and also in culture too. Looking at my children's generation, ladies are much more powerful than men, really. Or they decide which restaurant to go, what car to buy. I mean, just looking at my family, my dad had total control of finance. Right now, my wife has total control. I don't know how much money is left in the bank account. So I think it's changing. It might still take time, but I was quite surprised when I heard from George the situation of France back in the 1970s.
Yeah.
That's like Japan today. So France was able to change this much, and Germany is changing. Why can't we?
Yeah.
In the English MBA, we have 40% women representation for 2013. This number is increasing, and I mean, if we do a fair evaluation, I think it should change.
Yeah. It's a journey. It's not there's no silver bullet. It's really it's a one after the other, and the one thing it's very important is you cannot let go. And that's our learning internally. You were talking about McKinsey is you cannot let go. You got to pay attention to it all the time, before it becomes stable.
Questions are open to men too. Okay. Yeah, Wilson.
Hi, my name is Wilson Chan. I'm from the full-time MBA program also. Thank you very much for your very actually eye-opening talk. I came from Canada originally, so I didn't really see this problem as much because I think it's a very there's always equal opportunity. I think it has been always a concept that's been there. But one of the titles of the Economist article that you put up was quota system. Yeah. I don't like the system, but I like what it does. So if a hard rule is what is actually the most effective thing you've seen so far? A hard rule, or has it actually been the HR policy looking for those specific traits that you saw are drivers of good?
Okay. I was expecting the question on quota. I actually love that question. Because we did spend a lot of time trying to figure out whether we could prove one way or the other that quotas work, and it's impossible. Because you cannot prove scientifically whether it works. The one thing I do know, which actually is proven, is the fear of quota works really well. So you threaten people to have quotas on executive committee. I can tell you they will promote women like no tomorrow. So it's fear of quotas. I think is now it is a bit of a philosophical question. It's a little bit the same as equal opportunity. So I'll tell you my personal view of these things, which is not a scientifically proven view. But I think if you are starting from a very difficult, very stretched position, you have to make an extra effort, and you have to create some advantage, because otherwise it's difficult. Now that advantage doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to take in. It doesn't have to not respect meritocracy, but you may be wanting to give more opportunities to people, to women, so that they can prove themselves. So, for example, one thing that I think is a brilliant thing, has worked very well when I've seen it, is on promotions, when you are succession plans. I would be fairly, I'm not very comfortable with the notion that you say 40% of the promoted people should be women or whatever. But what I think is very, very wise is to say that 40% of your successors that you put in your succession plan should be women. For a very simple reason. That doesn't mean the person will be chosen. But the question is the following. If the person does not find any woman who's qualified to be a successor, then the problem becomes his problem. Right? Why didn't you recruit or promote or train somebody who's capable of being it? So you don't have to put a target. You don't have to put a hard thing. You just put in something that enables you to ask the question, why were you not successful? And that works extremely well. The other thing I think is clearly a good thing is to have targets and metrics. Targets is not binding, but it's there. It's an aspiration. But then you have to measure. Are you making progress? And these measures should be promoted. So the proclamation from Keizaido Yukai saying we want 30% of women, I think is a very good thing if you actually promote and show the numbers. Because again, companies that do well will be more than happy to say that they do well. And therefore, it will create an incentive.
Two more questions. Sorry, the lady on with the white shirt. Yes, yourself. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I have two questions. The first question is, it was very interesting that you mentioned the women can make a wiser decision. But is there any specific research or data which consultant can punctuate their clients? And second question is, you said you did some survey at McKinsey Japan to find out the bias on women. But if you have done similar research in different offices in different countries, did you find any significant difference by country?
So I think your first question, I didn't say that women were making better decisions.
Sorry.
Maybe true, right? But what they do is they do it differently, on statistically. So they will do much more of a collective. So they will do it with multiple people involved, and they'll make a decision together. Men tend to be more individualistic. They'll do it by themselves alone.
We have your choice.
Yeah, exactly. And that is, in a sense, is a interesting point, because if you believe that the world is becoming much more connected, and that there is many more things that are becoming done in processes and networks, then you would believe that having more collective decision making is better. And that's my belief, right? That's what actually we surveyed CEOs around this about 2 years ago, about 1,000 C-level executives, and they all believed that there will be more need for collective decision making because you're working in networks. So I think on your first questions, I think it's not that it's better, but it's a different skill set, and it's therefore having more women, or more people with that collective decision making is probably a good thing to have, given the way that the world is evolving. I wasn't sure on your second question on whether there was a bias.
Yeah, you said you tried to promote. we wanted to have a more gender equality at the McKinsey, and then you said you did the survey to find out the bias, gender bias within McKinsey.
No, what we do in McKinsey is we don't look at gender bias. What we do look at what we do in every country in the world. We actually look at every promotion level. We actually make sure that we compare whether the rating for performance, we evaluate people's performance, is there a bias between men and women? So would women be lower rated than men at every level? What we found, and we're very, very careful to make sure that we follow that so that we don't have a bias. There's no difference that we can see between countries at this moment because we measure it, we don't have it anymore. What we do, and we do compare, is we do, if you want, employee satisfaction surveys within McKinsey, and we are very, very careful on looking at comparing between men and women, whether not only are they satisfied the same way, but also do they have the same view of their professional experience. Actually, and they're, depending on the places, I mean, Japan, we have exactly the same rating on the professional experience between men and women. But we have different views on the long-term aspiration, which I think is something we're working on. I don't think there is a systematic bias by country. I think what my experience is, it's very much related to leadership, how much the leadership is taking care of that topic.
I saw a lot of hands,
Yeah.
so if I may take all the questions first and kind of give a short response.
Okay.
Is that okay?
Yeah.
Can I have all the questions so that, okay, from the back. And I'll write
So
down the question.
Summarize afterwards.
Yeah, I'll write down the questions so that you can decide.
Yeah.
Dozo.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I have one question about the Japanese government policy. I heard that Japanese government is planning or has already decided to make it necessary for employers to allow their women employees to take 3 years child care leave. And do you think this is good to promote gender diversity in Japan?
Thank you. I'll just take all the questions. Kazuko-san.
I was wondering if I can ask you which variable of ROE the woman senior cause most impact?
Mm-hmm.
Because I'm asking for that because it's the tangible thing. If it's only leadership or to create a healthy culture, leadership matters. I think it takes a long time to make a visible output. So it's very difficult, tough challenge to convince the CEO the commitment. So I would like to ask you this question. Thank you.
Thank you. Next question. ごめんなさいね。じゃあ後ろから近い方からレコちゃん。いや、
Kind of continuing on this question, ROI, quantifying the benefits is really good. So I was just wondering, is there any industry-specific data? Is it 41% ROI increase is really good, except telecom? But does it vary too much based on the industries?
Okay.
Yeah.
And one more question. I'm basically from India. There is one slide said India is pretty bad. So if you can kind of talk a little bit about it.
Yeah.
Okay, next person.
About the number of female executive committee members, I think you mentioned that the organizational performance will change if we have more than 4?
3.
3. And do you think there's any meaning of the number, or it's just that target to good to have?
Okay. Why 3?
You mentioned, One thing that I believe in is fairness and opportunity. But unfortunately, in the world we live today, the system, or what you call it, is biased towards a man's way of living. And you mentioned yourself, but women are from Venus, men are from Mars. We're a total, completely different species. And I believe there is truth in this, and that there's no way that you can make a complete system that can equally measure the performance of a man and a woman in the same way. What would you, in your regard, as a system that measures performance for men and women equally?
Thank you for very eye-opening presentation today. My question is, I think one of the reasons Japanese company and the Japanese society cannot change is extra works. And then if actually management still believe key success factor is extra work, it is really hard to change the situation. I don't know, France has the same problem 30 years before, I don't know, but if it was so, how did France overcome that kind of situation and problem? I really would like to know.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. I work for an kind of old school Japanese company in the manufacturing sector, industrial machinery. I think Japan and Germany is very alike in the industrial, how do you say, what the strong points. And I think that's why kind of Germany was slower than other European countries. So my personal belief is that Japan would take much longer time to change the gender diversity compared to France. But is there a way to persuade the top management, which are mostly men 60 years and older, as you said, to change their mind in this kind of old school industry?
I think there's one more over there.
So thank you so much for the great speech. Sorry, this might bring you to a different direction, but I was wondering if you had any comments on inclusion. So D&I, diversity and inclusion, are often brought in a set. So I've started to think that, of course, macroeconomic advantages and, our ROEs are great, and I love your 9-block logic. And I was wondering if promoting gender diversity might be training the company and the old boys club to become familiar with alien ideas that is new to them. So to bringing kind of innovation to a very uniform thing. So I was wondering if you had any comments on inclusion.
Okay. Let's start with that.
Hayashi-san, do you have a question?
Yeah.
Thank you very much for your lectures. My question is related to extra work. If the man knows if she promoted, she will get more burden, as you mentioned, the woman's reluctance, also absence of female role models. So the man cannot select the ladies because he does not want to make more burden in her future. That is the one of the obstacle. Even extra work, also more jobs and responsibility to her. If she thinks that opportunity is a chance, it's good. But if she does not want, it is not the chance. It's just a burden. So can you change this mentality in the past in France or other countries, if you can give us?
Very good. Yeah.
The audience, you are very lucky. We're getting professional advice from, the head of McKinsey in Japan. George, you can pick and choose.
Let me maybe start with the question, because I think it's the question on the analytics a little bit, and then we'll move on to some of the elements. The industry difference it's not that different. I can't remember the number in my head, but we have them in one. If you look at our Women Matter, one of the Women Matter research, if you look on the website, you will see difference by industry. It's not particularly. There is a couple of industries that are different, but otherwise it's the numbers are not particularly different. The important thing about you cannot differentiate specifically how much of the ROE is due to what, right? So you know what it is. What is very clear is the indication is that part of it will be driven by the leadership models, but it's probably not the only one. But at least that one we're pretty clear that it's the richness of leadership model, which brings me to the notion of, it is not about that that only women will have those leadership. It's statistically significant, so men and women will have overlap in terms of what model of leadership. What it really says, I think, and that's very important to have in mind, is companies with better processes and systems and culture to promote the best people will have better performance. And therefore, I think you would probably see the same results if you were going to use other type of profiling, race, cultural origin. And I think what it says is, if you have a system that works well and you promote really for the best people, you'll pick 50% of the IQ being in the women and 50 in the men, you'll have more of them. So I think what it says is a good, well-performing company that really addresses that will have better people, which I think is the answer to your inclusion question, which I think is the reason why I think this is important to think about the women, by the way. It's not just about the women. It's just about, because what my experience is that companies who actually take for seriousness this notion of diversity, it will apply to everything. And so if you're becoming a global company and you've got operations in India, in China, in Africa, you want the best people from everywhere. If your system has been made for middle-aged male American, to take a pot shot at my friends, you won't get the best people, right? But if you're saying, I want the best people regardless of where they come from, regardless of their origin, and I will help train them on what they don't know or what they don't, then the system works. So that I think is, the philosophy on sort of impact, performance, the inclusion.
And George, if I may speak on behalf of my friends at McKinsey, including yourself, if you have bad strategy, the performance will not come. So,
absolutely. Yes, that is very true. That is very true. Now, there is a real question that you're talking about, the extra work and the overtime, I think you mean, right? And it is a big issue in the, I think, in the Japanese system, and in particular, I think there is, Japanese companies will have to address this question about, are you paid for time spent, or are you paid for performance and results? And it is a hindrance for gender diversity, as it is a hindrance for performance generally, anyway. Because I don't believe you can be performing by spending 16 hours a day, and going to restaurants, and there's just a limit to human strengths and to brain power. But I think it's a big impediment. So I think that's it's interesting because if I look at the at least Western Europe, which I know better, I think we had a bit of that notion, and that but as time passed, there has been and as performance, the importance of performance become more important in corporate governance. this has changed also the view of performance from individuals. And so over time, but it's a slow process by definition. But this is, again, something on which the senior management has a very big role to play. If the senior management says, you know what, I don't value people who stay very late. I value people who deliver. You will make that change. But it's a tough one to change in Japan. It's clearly a difficult and challenging problem. What I've seen in Europe makes me relatively optimistic, because I think you could say the same thing. And I think it has changed. It has changed very slowly. I remember 10 years ago, one of my friends, who was working in a company in the U.S., and then she moved back to France. Same company, American company. In the U.S., she would leave at 6 o'clock to go back home and take care of her children, and then do whatever work she wanted afterwards. In France, when she would leave at 7, people would make comments around, you're allowed because you're a woman. It's just, now you wouldn't have, that comment would not exist. So, it's a slow moving target. But is this an impediment? Absolutely. Now, someone asked a question about, you asked a question about, how can you make it change? I have to tell you, I was very surprised in Japan when I arrived, because as I said, I met many, I've met, now it's about 80 CEOs overall, and they're all sort of men, 60 and above, right? This is Japan. I was quite surprised at how many of them were really concerned about this topic. But the problem is, I think they are concerned at that level, and they do nothing on the rest. And so I think the question is, how do you make the next generation worry? And that generation is a problem, because they have lived through the last 2 decades where there's not that many leadership positions. So, the fact of being in a slow growth economy creates an additional limit to, would you promote women when it means that there'll be less job for men? Right? And it's a bit of a problem. But the number of people that I think are really concerned is real, and part of it is because they see the demographics. And with the demographics, there's absolutely no question that you need to help women succeed.
George,
or you need to immigrate.
If I may add a comment. I have many female managers who work with me, and they constantly push me. Nakamura, it's not overtime work, it's performance. You have to understand. So maybe there's some of the things that you can do. You can push your boss.
It's true.
And I've been told this maybe 3 years, 4 years now. And if you're told constantly, I think you start to change. I used to work in a Sogo Shosha, so very old industry. But a lot of my female managers are educating me. So maybe you can do a little bit on your side as well. Yeah. Sorry, back to you.
No, and by the way, it's very true. I mean, if I look at the French office where I come from, when I joined the firm, there was no women partners. Now we have, I think, 14 women partners, so about a third. And but they're very disciplined, and they're ruthless. They will not spend time when it's not necessary. And they'll tell you, stop goofing around, right? Which I like to do. So it's a bit of a problem. But anyway, so you have to be disciplined. You have to be able to, which is not natural. You have to be able to actually defend and say, no, are we agreeing on what we need to deliver? Then. Now, the 3 or more women, I forgot that one. The 3 or more women is very interesting. First of all, it was statistically true. So, and we could not go beyond 3, because after that, there was not enough samples, right? So that was a limitation to the problem. Now, 3 is not a magic number. I think the reason why 3 counts is for a couple of reasons. One, it happens that if you take executive committees or boards, 3 is about 30%, in 25, 30%, right? So you could say that. But I think more importantly, what I've observed from my own views or what I've talked to women is that it means that there are several people who have the same type of reactions in the room. That's why one is not enough, because look at I was talking about my friend who came back from the US to France and said, when you have one woman in this room and it says, I have to go and take care of my children, and then nobody else around the room takes care of their children or it's very hard to have a voice, right? But if you have three of them and they start talking about this is normal, then there is a voice. There is a market share, if you want, of influence. You have a market share of the volume of noise. And I think that's the reason why 3 or above it makes a difference, because there is a block that has a voice. How to take women? It's a tricky. Your question about it. Should you have a different evaluation system for men and women? I think it's a tricky question. I think philosophically, I think what you need to have is clarity of what you want as outcomes and what you want people to do. And I don't care if it's men or women. Then, maybe men and women will be doing it differently. What, on the other hand, is clear is that, again, we've moved in McKinsey to what we call strengths-based development system. Because there's academic evidence that people develop much better if you build on your strengths than if you're trying to correct your weaknesses. I mean, you have to have a certain minimum level, right? But build that. So I think it will depend on the individual. Does that mean that I would say that for a same job, I would not expect the same from anybody? No, I think so I don't think the system has to be differentiated. What it has to be is neutral. And that's not easy. That's really not easy, because the unwritten biases or even written biases can be immense. If you have a certain style of influence, if your systems reward certain style of behaviors, you might have created a bias. So that's why it takes a lot of efforts to modify your evaluation system. The Japanese government 3-year, that's a tricky one. Let me tell you, I think it's great from a personal standpoint. I completely welcome the fact that women would have the choice. But there is no such thing as a free lunch. So if you have not done leadership, if you have not been a leader for 3 years, you cannot expect to be at the same leadership role as somebody who will, right? I mean, so you have to be. It does not come free. Now it has to. The good news is it gives you a choice. But we shouldn't expect that this will be free, and I think that's a big issue. There is actually research that shows that leadership roles tend to be correlated to the number of leadership hours you've done. So the more time you spend as a leader, the more. So if you're not in the workforce for 3 years and have not done leadership roles, well, and I think that's important for women to understand that, right? Because otherwise there is false expectations. So for example, at McKinsey, what we do is when women leave for maternity or they go on part-time, we adjust what we call their tenure, the time that they've been in that particular role. Because you have to be consistent with the number of hours you've been a leader, or days, or whatever. So I think I'm all in favor of it, but it has, I don't think that's, this will not be necessarily beneficial. This may be beneficial longer term because the person will be happier and therefore will be a better leader. But it's not free. And then India, I don't know. All I can tell you is that I saw the numbers. I mean, not me, just me. Our Indian partners were shocked. What they tell me is part of it is the issue of very deep cultural view that family shouldn't be there. Something around the opportunities in terms of education. I don't know, but it's just astonishing. Now, you have to correct for number of people at the poverty level and farmers, and because that's not comparing completely equivalent. You cannot compare Taiwan and India from an industry structure point of view. You still have a large portion of India which is agrarian population, where if you think of most of these other countries have moved into urban situation. So I think that is clearly one bias. But it is, especially when we have all these notions of, Indira Gandhi and all these very famous and extraordinary Indian women in parliament and government, and so I don't know, but it's a big challenge. It's a good challenge for you. That's what I told my Indian partners. I said, when we looked at the numbers, I said, oh, you know what the challenge is.
Thank you, George, and thank you very much for spending so much time, answering all the questions. George-san and Paul-san volunteered to be here for a little bit for exchanging name cards. If you want to exchange name cards, please maybe keep it simple so that they have time to spare with their family. But with that, I'd like to hand over to Satoko-san. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. DeVoe and Dean Nakamura, for your insightful and enjoyable discussion.
Thank you so much.